The eighth unwritten rule of work is to not be perceived as too aggressive, and this was disproportionately with my Black respondents. I'm Dr. Anna Kalschmidt. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, and I research the unwritten rules of work for people from low-income backgrounds, but I also look at how it overlaps and differs with other identities. In this study, I interviewed Black and white women and men who were from low-income backgrounds who'd moved up to higher class via their employment, and there was only one white man who brought up that he had to be careful not to be perceived as too aggressive. 20% of the white women brought it up, but 71% of the Black women and 70% of the Black men brought it up. Again, disclaimers that we don't usually put percentages of qualitative work. That's just to give you a sense of how different it was. And I had about half the amount of Black men that I did in any of the other identity groups because I had a very hard time recruiting Black men for this study, likely because I'm neither Black nor a man. The last unwritten rule that I talked about in unwritten rule number 7 was that they had to learn to be more assertive at work. And Black women were the biggest group in that code. They were almost 60%, while the other groups were about a third. So this tells me that Black women were navigating having to be assertive enough, learning to be more assertive, but not too much because they were perceived as more aggressive. And this is very consistent with a lot of other research on that there's a stereotype that Black people, in particular Black women, are very aggressive. Ironically, over the past week and a half, we've been talking on here about studies on who is allowed to show anger at work. And I wish I could tell you I was that good of a content planner to plan this the week and a half before I announced this unwritten rule, but I'm not. It just was coincidence. We've been talking about how people in higher status are allowed to show anger, and then showed research on that, and then people are like, yeah, but there's a gender difference. Men are allowed to show anger. Yes, but not Black men. I know showing anger and aggression aren't necessarily the same thing, but they're very related. And that if you're easily perceived as aggressive, do you think you're allowed to show anger at work without backlash? Harvard Business Review did a study on over 300 people where they showed them examples of Black versus white, men versus women being neutral or aggressive, and what did people attribute their anger to. And people attributed Black women's anger to an internal characteristic instead of an external one. So for other respondents, people were more likely to blame an issue or an external problem, but for Black women, people blamed an internal, like this is just their personality. The respondents also rated these Black women with poor perceptions of performance and less leadership ability, like perceptions of leadership ability. So these stereotypes that we have in our mind, they do impact real work outcomes, and that's not anything new. We know that from studies across decades. I looked for a specific study on Black men and aggression, and I didn't find anything. I just found a lot on how Black men are hyper-sexualized at work. So I'm really interested to see what my future studies bring about this.